Well, we're ready to start a new subject tonight. The Christian in death. You want a heading? It's like most everything else in Christendom today, what we see is not what the Bible teaches or what the early church practiced. That's true of much of life and certainly true of death. Also, it'll be quite enlightening, I'm sure, to your spiritual education to learn some things that maybe you didn't know about this whole subject. Now, all the courses and books on ethics that I've ever dealt with or read, I've never found any of them that deal with death. They all deal with life, how to live the Christian life, but never with death. I don't understand why they don't deal with death. I always did in ethics when I taught it. Death is the most profound experience that a person goes through. I mean, the cessation of life in the physical body as we know it is profound and has certain ethical questions connected with it. Because of the shocking degree of misunderstanding and pagan practices in connection with the modern day funeral, especially in America, it would pay us to come to some scriptural understanding about God's attitude toward the body and the life and the soul. We're not going to deal with the subject of death. That comes under theology, eschatology, theology. We're dealing here with ethical questions connected with death and terminal illness and modern practices. So I'll be treating it under several headings, such as final illness, terminal illness, death itself, the funeral, the whole question of embalming, whether or not it's scriptural. Again, you might come into some light on this. Americans alone of all cultures display their dead. Americans alone. And it's an abomination in some cultures. Just the thought of painting and perfuming a body and then putting it on display for the public, that takes away all the dignity of that person. He can't help himself, you see. Well, anyway, we'll get to that later. Problems like suicide and euthanasia, mercy killing, cremation, Christian cremation. Now there's a question. Have you ever thought about it? Should a Christian be cremated? Well, it's important to God. It might be well for you to know what God's attitude is. The right to die. The medical authorities are taking away from people the right to die. They tell you when you can die. Yeah, that's right. They've got the machinery and the authority now to just take over your body when it should have died, and they can sustain it in a vegetable existence for up to a year or more. All right, well, let's come to the subject then that we're looking at. The Christian in death. What are the ethical questions connected with this? And we'll start with the problems concerning terminal illness. Final illnesses we're talking about. The problems in connection with terminal illnesses. Now, there's certainly a Christian philosophy about all of this, and we need to learn what it is. I want to say one thing before we get onto this, that keep in mind we are not dealing with this from the standpoint like we would approach illness or death. We'd simply pray for the sick. We have to realize there's a world out there. They're dying, by the tens of thousands every day. And most Christians don't have any faith or believe in divine healing. Most Christians. And very few charismatics when it gets down to terminal things. They put themselves in the hands of the doctors. And so we'll make statements that won't apply to us, but I can't stop each time and say, no, here's what we would do. Like I will say, a lot of people die from accidents suddenly. Well, a person who's walking out Psalm 91 and by faith isn't going to make a confession like that. I'm going to die suddenly by tragedy or something. But this is a reality we must face when we as Christians have to deal with other Christians and other peoples, like your own family. You see, and you have to understand they'll never think like you do along the line of Christian ethics, because the church has fallen victim to a lot of pagan customs, and the first thing to think, what will people say if we don't display the corpse? And you mean you're not going to give their relatives a last chance to view them, see them for the last time. Well, I personally don't like to remember people as I've seen them in caskets. I like to remember them before they got sick or dropped dead or whatever. They say, oh, don't they look natural? No, they look very unnatural. That's a horrible sight to see what you see in a cushioned, perfumed, flower-surrounded casket that cost a small fortune. So keep that in mind so that, again, we don't have to have questions between the sessions about, well, now what about this, what about that? Keep in mind we're talking about dealing with the question of death as it applies to the human race. So we can start by saying many people die. Death occurs suddenly by accident, heart failure, and that sort of thing. You see, now if we had to digress, we'd right away say, now, but we wouldn't make that confession. But we have to recognize that that's true. So we're not dealing with those in this study. We're dealing with those cases which are in the majority where there is a longer or shorter period of terminal illness. That's what we're talking about. Our first concern is going to be with the ethical problems that arise when there's a longer or shorter period of terminal final illness before death. The first question we're going to look at, it's a basic question. In terminal illness, when the patient is beyond hope in the natural, one basic question is this: should the patient be told the true nature and seriousness of his condition? Should he be told the true nature and the seriousness of his condition? Should he be told that he's dying? Now, if you wonder why such a question is, you just may be surprised how many people pass away in a coma under sedation and drugs that didn't know they were dying. Oh, keep the news from him. He's only got about 6 weeks. Let's just sedate him into oblivion. He'll go out painlessly. And he never had an opportunity to face death. He was robbed of the dignity of his own death. If he became a coward, okay, but he didn't have the opportunity to be brave or a coward or become a Christian or as a Christian say, praise the Lord, I'm going to be with the Lord. He's robbed of that. So this is an important question because especially ministers, it's true, it's important with respect to them, but it's important with respect to any Christian, because you see most doctors, the answer given by medical authorities is no to that question. Should the patient be told? Generally the answer will be no. Most doctors and hospital authorities insist that it's their right alone to inform the patient if he's going to be informed. That no mere minister or Christian, no member of the family, no friend, especially no minister. Doctors really have an antagonism toward the ministry of those few who are ethical. Amen. Most ministers have conformed to the wishes of the medical authorities, and if they say don't tell, then if a man asks them, will you tell me the truth, am I dying? Is this serious? He either lies to him or avoids the question or answers his question with a question. This is the way we were taught in the seminary. Answer the question with a question. You follow the clinical procedure and don't ever get out of it. The seminaries are the place where you just conform to medical wishes. But anyway, most doctors and hospitals insist that the right belongs to them alone to decide. Now, before we actually try to answer that, I think we need to have a little understanding of the modern attitude or frame of mind regarding illness before we actually answer that question. Of course, we've already answered it from the clinical standpoint. Generally, they'll say no. If they're to be told, we'll tell them. And generally, they don't want to do that if they can avoid it. They just sedate you into oblivion, as I said. But we need to understand something about the attitude, especially in America, toward terminal illness, before we try to answer it from a Christian standpoint. Now, in America especially, this is true of a few other places to some degree, but especially in America, with its freedom from war on its soil, most of you have never witnessed the tragedy of death, except you might have seen it on the highway or a few veterans from Vietnam or somewhere. In our modern culture, with all of the modern medical facilities and the ways of dealing with terminal illness and so forth, most people, and that's true of most people here, death is no longer seems a genuine threat or reality. I doubt that very few of you here have ever seen anybody die, and yet that's been common up until our generation, to have witnessed death, for example, in one's own family. But that doesn't happen anymore. A person gets sick, he's wheeled off to a hospital. I don't know if you're aware of it, but over half of the deaths occur in a hospital with no one around but medical technicians, not even family seeing the death. If he's starting to gasp, they get you out of there and they take over and get him over the river. Most people never witness death anymore in our culture, and then even if a member of the family's in the hospital, you don't see the corpse. He's covered up, wheeled out, taken to a funeral home. By the time anyone ever gets to see him, he looks better than he did in the last stages of his terminal illness. So they're hiding the fact and reality of death from us. There are many books written on this. We'll give you some of them later. Things like The American Way of Death and The High Cost of Dying and so forth and so on. It is true that in America, most of us never witnessed the tragedy of dying. But the average person, even Christians, they don't really have any faith. And you'd be surprised what a gruesome experience it is to watch a person die. Gasping and agonizing and death rattling and not going off in his sleep like Moses. Outside maybe a few of you that might have seen somebody killed on the highway or seen death as a soldier. Most Americans have never witnessed it. Since the Civil War, never had any corpses on our soil as in other nations. And then after you get to the funeral home, the word death or dying or dead is taboo. You stop and think, when's the last time you ever heard the word death or dead in a funeral home or at a gravesite? I dare say you've never heard it. Now you might have, but it'd be rare if you did. Oh no, he's over there. He's deceased. He's in the beyond. He's on the other side. He's with the Lord if it's Christian, but he didn't die. Oh, and funeral directors and ministers and people in your clinical psychology, like you have to take in seminaries today, pastoral psychology and that sort of stuff, tells you how to minister to the sick. I mean, from their standpoint, and the dying and the bereaved family and all, and you're taught never to use those words like corpse, dead, death, but brother so-and-so has passed away. Well, in America, you see what we're dealing with, a certain attitude that when you come along with a Christian philosophy, Christian attitude, a Christian point of view, you won't be too popular even among Christians, because we're living in a culture when even the reality of pain has escaped people. First symptom, rush to the doctor, and if necessary, he rushes to the hospital. If necessary, they rush you into surgery, and then they drug you, cut you open, sew you up, and then keep you half drugged until all the pain's gone. And you wake up about 2 weeks later, well, that wasn't so bad. And then when they have a simple headache, they can't report for work or miss church. You don't know what pain is. How can you even overcome pain if you don't know what it is? How can you pray for somebody who's going through a trial if you don't know what sickness and death and pain? Well, Americans are always criticizing youth for taking drugs, but we're the most drugged country in the world because we are drugged out of reality of death and pain and sickness and everything else. Well, then the question is, should a terminal patient be told he's dying? With that in view, let's come to that. And we'll look first at the clinical philosophy. that you'll get in seminary, and then later the Christian philosophy. Now, philosophy only means point of view, so if you like the term better, use that. I've even got my old seminary notes here, so I'm going to give you what we were taught. I've got a whole page here. I took it down in the seminary, and it's headed Ministry to the Dying. And it sounds like something down at General Hospital, what the doctors would be taught or practice. You'd never know you were in a seminary. But I found that so true in so many courses that I came to no longer grunt and sigh and moan when they would announce the headings and subjects, but endure it and figure I could profit from it by someday teaching people what not to do or believe. But it's pretty sad because the whole business, there was no Christian philosophy or approach at all, not a single verse of Scripture cited. In fact, we were told, and told in no uncertain terms, you as a Christian minister have absolutely no right to do anything contrary to the doctor or hospital's wishes. And you raise the question, but what if it's contrary to the Word of God? But it never enters their mind to. Well, they'll tell you can't minister in a hospital where you don't follow the rules. There'll be a lot of places you won't minister if you follow the Bible. All right, so we're giving you their point of view without a lot of comment until we get to the Christian philosophy. These are facts, we were told. These are facts that you should know before you decide to say anything. First of all, facts you should know before you decide to say anything. What are those facts? First of all, what is the diagnosis? In other words, what minister would presume to tell a patient anything if he didn't know the diagnosis? I suppose all the medical terms. It was all so simple before they invented seminaries and pastoral psychology courses. You just dealt with a person in the hospital room or wherever as lost or saved and went on from there. But anyway, what's the diagnosis? These are facts you must know before you even think about saying anything, we were taught. Secondly, what has the doctor told the patient? Of course, obviously, you don't dare tell them anything that he hasn't told you. Thirdly, should he even be told anything? And fourthly, if he's to be told anything, he's to be told on a clinical basis only. Not spiritual, biblical, or anything else. He should be advised only on a clinical basis. In other words, you simply repeat what the doctor said you could say. Now, what's their logic for following this procedure? This is the clinical procedure, by the way, in doctors dealing with terminal patients. We're talking about terminal patients, not just sick people. The clinical logic. Well, they reason this way. The diagnosis that the patient is dying is one of high probability, but not absolute certainty, ever. The diagnosis that the patient is dying terminally, while it is one of high probability, is not one of absolute certainty. In other words, the doctors say occasionally we can be wrong. There are people alive that we've said had 6 weeks to live or 6 months or whatever. And so if you rush in and say, well, you're dying, the doctors say they shouldn't be told they're dying. Keep that from them, because 1 out of 1,000,000 sometimes doesn't die. You can see the fallacy in this sort of reasoning, but anyway, that's why they say you shouldn't be told. It's because it isn't absolutely certain, even though all the medical evidence says they're dying. Secondly, because the process of illness, now that's a phrase, the process of illness shows that such a diagnosis that a patient is dying, for example, such a diagnosis has to be assimilated by the patient. The process of illness shows that such a diagnosis that a patient is dying has to be assimilated by the patient. In other words, that knowledge only comes in a process. You don't rush in and say you're dying. He couldn't assimilate that all at once, according to clinical psychology. And what is that process of illness we're talking about? It's called the knowledge process in terminal cases. And there are certain steps to it. The knowledge process in terminal cases. All this can be helpful because when I deal with people, there's a lot of truth in some of the things they say, and you know they go through certain aspects in their mind, and you can deal with them spiritually where they're at. Because you'll see this knowledge process has some validity to it. The first step in case of a terminal patient in this knowledge process is that he must accept the knowledge of his illness. A lot of people won't accept the fact they're sick, even though they end up in the hospital. They just won't admit it to themselves, they're sick. A lot of people. So to tell him he's dying before he'll admit he's sick is kind of getting ahead of it. And even for spiritual reasons, you're not going to convince him he ought to deal with his soul if he's lost, if he doesn't believe he's sick. Now you might wonder how a person can be in the hospital and be on medicine and not think he's sick, but it's just the way of human beings. A lot of people won't accept the fact they're sick, so he has to accept the knowledge of his illness. They said that in the process of illness, we have seen that the knowledge a person is dying has to be assimilated by that person, a little at a time. The second step is his acceptance or his knowledge of its chronicity, how chronic it is. The knowledge of its chronicity. If he will accept he's sick, that fact, then he will start raising questions in his mind, how sick am I? And then he can be told clinically, not by friends, family, ministers, but by the doctor. This is the process they use. He can be told clinically that it's serious, but he's never told there's no hope, that he's dying. And we'll see later that doctors avoid that word too, like funeral directors and preachers today. They hate that word death. It's like a personal enemy to them. But he's not to be told there's no hope. Then the third step in this knowledge process is knowledge concerning length of life. He begins to question, how long do I have? Then he may ask questions of this third step. Now patients go through this in terminal cases. This is valid, as I say. Most patients go through this. They have to accept they're sick, then they have to accept how sick they are, and then they start raising questions about the future. And at this stage, some doctors will tell them, most won't. But if they don't raise questions at this stage, then they don't tell them, period, with few exceptions. But this is a stage where they're raising questions. Doctor, how long do I have? Is this as serious as you're telling me? And so forth. And then the fourth stage is facing death, facing the fact that they're dying. That's called the knowledge process of illness. Still on the good old seminary side, why not tell the person immediately? We have a clinical answer for that. Why not tell the person immediately he's dying? And the reply is, and this is true also, some never hear you. Now you may think that's impossible, that a doctor could say to a person he's dying and him not hear him. But that's the big question, and they hear what they want to hear. If you've dealt with as many people as I have, and some of the rest of us have, you'll find out a lot of things are true with respect to what we're telling you along this line. That some never would hear you if you just rushed in and said, you're dying. Well, of course, a lot of people will hear you. So that's not a valid reason from the Christian standpoint, but I'm giving you their point of view. Secondly, they say, why not to tell them immediately? It may militate against their chances of any recovery, any hope of recovery. It may work against, you see, any hope of recovery if he thinks he's dying. That's a pretty emotional reason. If they can't get you on the others, they usually get you there and say, that's why we don't want you up there in the hospital talking to our patients. You just come and read Psalm 23, or no, don't read Psalm 23, passing through the valley of death. Read some little passage. I inserted that. That was the Spirit given Psalm 23, I guess. But read some little passage that'll keep them smiling. I guess you know Psalm 23 says, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. So they wouldn't want you reading that. By the way, that'd be a good one to read if they didn't want you telling their patients anything, and you knew, and he was lost or saved for that matter. That'd be a good way to open the subject. Say, why did you pick that psalm? Well, brother, sister, the Lord would have me tell you, this is your last illness. And he's trying to speak to you through it before he meets you. Well, sometimes you have to talk that bluntly, but anyway, it may militate against their chances of recovery is the idea. You're not supposed to tell them. Now, what do they mean by that? Well, they say some patients give up. If they find out they're dying, they give up and go ahead and die. Of course, they're dying anyway, but we're not supposed to raise that question at this stage. It is true, people who are suffering might suffer another 6 months if they didn't know how serious it was. And it's not uncommon when they are told for them to pass away the same night. Why lie there for 6 months? It was just the will to live that kept them there, but they didn't know nothing about divine healing or anything, so they might as well get it over with, I guess. You can see we're dealing with it from a clinical standpoint. So it may cause them to give up. They say sometimes it results in suicide, but that remains to be proven. Occasionally that could happen. They just end it. Say sometimes the patient is also an acute heart patient, and you didn't know that, and you kill him ahead of time. But if he's dying, you know, that's still not much of an argument. We're talking about terminal cases where there's no hope outside a person being a Christian believing divine healing. So it's a little ridiculous talking about, you know, that he may suffer a heart attack, but he's dying anyway. And sometimes they want a new doctor, and the new doctor just has to start over, and there's time lost through all that process. Well, sometimes they don't die, and so they use that as a basis for dealing with all their patients. 99% who are terminal die. So these arguments are not valid for the 1%. So the alternatives, we were taught what are the alternatives to telling them. What are the alternatives to telling them? If a patient asks you, what have you been told? And you visit people in the hospital, sometimes they'll ask you that. Because doctors are notorious for not telling the patient anything except when the bill will be due. Well, it is true, they tell you nothing. What if he asks you? So what's the alternative? Well, it's suggested you answer the question with a question. Ask them, what has the doctor told you? And then say, and I'll stand with you. I'll stand with you regardless of what he's told you. Well, if he hadn't told them nothing, and most of the time he hasn't, that's a way to get out of it. But that's answering his question with a question. Ask them what the doctors have told them. In other words, let them tell you. But if the doctor hasn't told them, and they don't know anything, then you are obligated not to tell them anything. That's what we were taught. I never followed it, but a lot I never followed that they taught. This is not any exception. How in the world can you tell a person a lie or avoid the question? You could run after they ask you. And if you had an appointment, you could say, I just remembered an appointment, but you'd even have to have one of those to be telling the truth. Well, let's come to the Christian philosophy about this question, should a terminal patient be told? Because you see, all this doesn't deal with the questions of what if the patient is lost? You're going to let him go out into oblivion and eternity in hell and not give him one last opportunity to face the fact that he's going to meet God pretty soon? See, we're talking about people who don't know that. They call bone cancer arthritis. You see, well, you've got a touch of arthritis. They even lie to them like that. They know their bones are hurting and all. Or leukemia, you've got anemia. They'll lie up one side and down the other to keep from telling him. We'll get to the why a little later. They have an aversion of the word death worse than funeral directors. But what if he's lost? See, that didn't face that question at all through this procedure. And what if he does ask you? You going to tell him a lie? So the Christian philosophy is that the answer to should he be told is, for a Christian, clearly, yes. It's that simple. There is absolutely no basis in the Bible for hiding the reality of death from a dying person. Especially if he's lost and especially if he's saved. I don't know any other way to say it. Especially if he's lost, that gives him a chance to go out not lost, and especially if he's a Christian, well, he can say, praise the Lord. To be absent from the body is to be present with Jesus. Why wake up and be surprised? Say, I don't understand this. I was 6 months there and they didn't say a word. And here I'm on the other side. Where am I, or whatever? He doesn't even have a chance to prepare. He may want to forgive Deacon Jones or something. That's right. So it isn't a question of whether or not he should be told. The only question is, how should he be told? Now that's very important, because not everybody knows how to tell people things. Now, how to tell them isn't when you learn it to rush into the hospital room, grab him by the shoulders and shake him and say, are you prepared to die? That'll get his attention. Now, if God anoints you as a prophet to go ahead and do something like that, you go ahead and do it, but that isn't the general procedure. The Lord sent me into hospital once. It was about another matter. Said to say to a young man that I love you. Is this a word from Jesus? I'm just delivering it. I love you. I want to save you and heal you. They were about to cut his arm off. Said, I've been lying here for 2 days believing that. Gave his heart to Jesus. And the other patient over there, I couldn't say that to him because the Lord didn't send me to say that. And he sent me by revelation right over there in Warsaw. You can't walk into the hospital room and get a person to make a confession of faith. Oh, he was ready. I had to almost find something to delay the process because he caught me almost off guard. Even though I knew what was going to happen, I didn't have any scriptures ready for him to, to cite to him or something. It just like that. God healed him. So sometime God may send you in to announce somebody, you're dying. You just walk in the room, you're dying. That'll get everybody's attention. But that generally isn't the way you do it. I've only done that once, you see. That way. So it's how should he be told? Now there are ways to do it right. Let the Spirit lead you, but here are some things that the Lord gives me, like you don't run over the hospital authorities, but you know the person's lost or saved, whatever. So you can ask them questions. How do you think you're progressing? And, leading questions. Or have you thought much about the real nature of your illness? Or of the future? Or questions like, this could be your last opportunity to deal with your spiritual needs. Or have you considered the possibility God may be trying to speak to you through this illness? And you'll be surprised how that can open the door to some questions from them, and the first thing you know, you haven't rushed in and said, hey, you're dying, but you could say, well, the Lord has shown me, and we know as a medical fact that this is terminal. You're not obligated to go and tell anybody anything. I didn't say that. They may already know they're dying and that sort of thing. I'm talking about in cases where it would be necessary for them to know. Yes, they should be told. It's just a question of how, not if they should. And also under Christian philosophy, there are other alternatives. There are other alternatives that the doctors can't offer them. See, the doctors can't offer them anything but drugs or deception or whatever, that they're not dying. But there are other alternatives that are available to the Christian, which you have if you will tell them, that you wouldn't have if you didn't tell them. That is, you can pray for their healing. If they don't know they're dying, then there's no way for you to pray for restoration. Now we're assuming as a Christian who wants this, who wants to believe James 5. It's not that you're looking for the sick to pray for, but if they know they're dying, then it gives you an opportunity to offer to pray for them if they want to believe the Word of God. Or another alternative, if he's lost, it gives him an opportunity to receive Christ. So we've got alternatives the doctors can't offer. One is healing, the other is salvation. At any rate, no lie or deception is ever justified, regardless of the medical rationale about it. No lie or deception is ever justified. Of course, as we've said, the hospitals, if they find out you're not dealing with their patients on a clinical basis, they have such a strong view of their own power, authority, and importance that they will bar a minister or you as a Christian from ministering in their hospital. But as I've said, if you stay with the Word of God, there'll just be a lot of places you can't minister. So I don't know why that would bother anybody that's going to stay with the Word. They should expect it. As one doctor who does believe that you should tell patients said, I wish I'd have thought of this myself. It's too good not to share, but as one doctor who tells all of his patients, terminal patients, the truth, said, if one must walk through the valley of the shadow of death, it's better to go through without a blindfold. I thought that was real good. He believes in telling patients. He says, if you have to go through the valley of the shadow of death, that it's better to go through without a blindfold. In other words, you should know you're dying. Now you stop to think about it, most people don't know. That's where medical science has advanced to. They can sedate you to the place that you just go out through one long coma. You don't even know the world exists. Or maybe they do know and can't help themselves because the spirit doesn't sleep. That is, maybe they would like to get back to reality so they could say a goodbye or get right with God or whatever. And they can't because they're paralyzed by the drugs. So it robs them of their right to die, as we'll see later. Medical science is robbing people of the right to die. Should a doctor tell? I've got an article here from Reader's Digest by a doctor, and he's got a great big yes. He's an exception, believe me. But let's hear what a doctor says that believes a patient should be told, so we can see this isn't just a personal opinion or a religious approach as such, but that there are some doctors who see the foolishness of keeping a patient in the dark. So this doctor says, during my many years that I've practiced medicine, I've repeatedly been told that a seriously ill patient who hears the truth about his condition may become suicidal or mentally unstable. Well, I've been telling my patients the truth for a long time, and I've never seen either of these things happen. Well, I won't read the whole article, just certain excerpts. But there's a doctor who puts that idea aside that we gave you, that we got in seminary, by the way. But here's a doctor who says there's nothing to it. He says, the only patients I've ever heard about who committed suicide were those who were not told the truth but suspected the worst. See, just the opposite. In my experience, it is beneficial for patients to hear the truth even when it's very bad news. A man or woman who is seriously ill is more afraid of the unknown than of the known. One can easily tell a patient you have a little arthritis when actually it's bone cancer. A man who has leukemia may be told he is only anemic. A part truth, of course, that adds up to a deliberate deception. Well, he's calling it that, calling his medical colleagues deceivers. But there is no way you can soothe away or lie about the fact that these patients see themselves getting progressively worse. I find that the truth somehow enables the patient to feel a certain satisfaction. Relieved of his gnawing suspicion, he's able to accept with equanimity the fact that he is ill, which is a state of mind that has obvious medical advantages. He thinks it's better off for them to know, because then they know what they're facing. I make a policy to tell my patients everything about their illness that they can understand. How you tell them is what's important. You can't tell a patient he's dying in 4 or 5 minutes, he says. Well, there's a lot here that's beneficial to read. He says, my opinion, no doctor should take upon himself to say to a patient, you have 10 weeks to live, or 3 months, or 2 years, or whatever. Statistical probabilities of life and death are useful in medical research, but cannot be applied with any accuracy to an individual case. I know a farmer in New Hampshire who is still milking cows 12 years after he was foolishly told to be prepared to die. The doctor who put a date on his patient's doom is dead. One patient, 30 years before her death, was told she couldn't live over a few weeks. Every doctor she went to told her that. She lived for 30 years, more. Doctors simply do not know when patients are going to die. So he believes in telling the truth. Why hide it from them? Then they may fight against their illness. The patient who hears the truth from his doctor is given an opportunity to seek religious consolation. He's able to plan for the future of his family. Well, he's looking at it from a practical standpoint. And then he's the one that said, if one has to walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I think it's better to go without a blindfold. There are repeated public opinion surveys that show that a vast majority of people insist that I want to be told about any diagnosis that reveals a dangerously or apparently fatal illness. All of the surveys show the people want to know. They don't give the people the choice. I think you ought to have the choice if you're going to go that route, the hospital and all that. There ought to be a place on the forms you have to fill out. I want to be told if it's serious. I want the whole truth, nothing but the truth. So help you, doctor. And if he wants to be lulled into oblivion with drugs and not know, then let him check that. But he doesn't even have the right to choose. Other surveys conducted among cancer patients, heart patients, and other groups of fatally ill persons aware of their condition, these surveys show they were glad to know exactly what was wrong with them. Well, why do doctors then deny the patient the right to know? Well, I've got another question. It'll take a long time to answer, so I don't want to start it. We better save that till next time. And that's, how long are doctors morally obligated to try to sustain life in a dying person? We've got cases here we'll tell you that it's ludicrous. Keep a person on machines as a human vegetable for a year when all they'd have to do is pull the plug and nature would take its course. And the point is, the person isn't alive. He's in a coma, a vegetable. Well, it's morally irresponsible, to say the least. Yeah, for those who want it, I'll give you the date on the article, because Reader's Digests are available at the libraries. January 1963. That's about when I was teaching it in the seminary. Should the Doctor Tell is the title of the article. Should the Doctor Tell? January 1963. There's also the opposite view in there, but we'd already given that, in the introduction. In that same article, they have both sides.